You know, you have to act like Jiminy Cricket if you decide to kill a living being. Always ask yourself by what right. Basically, in French Guiana, you see, it's as big as Brittany, and there are 10 times more fish species than in all of France. There's a lot of talk about 4 degrees of warming by 2100. What isn't said enough is that if we're at 4 degrees in 2100, it means we haven't solved the problem. In other words, it means we'll be on a trajectory that's still rising. There are species that really need us to leave them alone. I mean, really completely.
Hello Bernard Chevassus-au-Louis, it's an honor to be able to talk with you for a bit. You are a biologist, so we'll be able to really dive deep into this topic and also look a bit at the issues behind it, as well as our place in nature and in different ecosystems. Before we begin, could you briefly introduce yourself and share your background for those unfamiliar with you?
Yes, well, I like to say that I'm a naturalist rather than a biologist. That is to say, geological phenomena and other things also interest me and were part of my training. A book that made an impression on me is one called The Sea Around Us, which I got when I was 10 years old. And the author's name was Rachel Carson, who is much better known for having written a book called Silent Spring, but at the time she was an oceanographer. It was also the time when Cousteau was around. And it's true that it gave me an interest in living creatures from the ocean, from the water, and so on. So I actually studied biology and specialized more in genetics. And then I was able to have a research career by combining this expertise in genetics and applying it to marine or aquatic living beings, fish, shrimp, oysters. So that's my background as a researcher. And for the past 10 years, I've been leading an NGO called Humanity and Biodiversity. As its name suggests, we need to explain to everyone what biodiversity is, why it's important, and how and why we need to take care of it. So I give talks, presentations, and meet with people aged 7 to 77 and even beyond to talk about what I'm passionate about, which is the diversity of living beings.
University of Ottawa. By the way, to get right to the heart of the matter, what do we mean by biodiversity? What's the definition we can give to that?
I like to use the definition that it's the same thing as a human society, but extended to all living beings. In other words, when we ask someone, do you know what a human society is? They will answer yes. It's a group of people who are more or less related, who are connected to each other, who have various kinds of relationships, who move around, who reproduce. And biodiversity is the same thing, except that in this group we include all living beings and not just our species, which is only one of the species in biodiversity. So that's what I like as a definition. It's the diversity of living things.
Speaking of living things, there are a huge number of life forms that are part of the ecosystems in which we interact. Is there more broadly a precise definition of living things?
Well, I like to say that there's a debate, for example, about viruses, and we talked a lot about it during the COVID period, because indeed it's often said that there are two things that define living things. There's the ability to reproduce, which is true for viruses, and there's the ability to be autonomous, which scientists refer to as metabolism, meaning the ability to draw energy to build themselves. But viruses indeed only have half of these two properties. They can reproduce, sometimes by parasitizing other living beings, but they cannot indeed have autonomous chemical reactions. But it turns out that it's biologists who study them, so there's a paradox. But indeed, this question of the boundaries of life with these beings that we still don't really know, because when someone tells you that a virus, to reproduce, it has to parasitize a living being, I was asked, so how did the story begin? Because they couldn't have been there before, since they need a living being. So the question that is still relevant today is it they are born at any time, maybe even today as we speak, are viruses appearing? Or have they been around for a long time and then found it more convenient to parasitize the new living beings that appeared? Are they very ancient or very modern? We don't really know.
Right now, that's a question.
There you go. And, we'll probably talk about it. The number of things we don't understand is probably much greater than the number of things we do understand in the field of biology and biodiversity.
All right. even today in 2025 with the perspective we have on these research fields?
Yes, so not understanding something is not ignorance. We observe things, we describe them, but when we try to dig a little deeper, for example, when someone tells you, let's move away from biology for a moment, they tell you the Earth revolves around the Sun, and there are other planets that revolve around the Sun, like Mars, Venus, and so on. When someone says we don't know how long it will last, you might be surprised and think it'll last forever, but we can't prove that. That in millions and billions of years, it will keep going like that. So there are things like that which we describe, but we're not sure we understand or can prove today.
We hear a lot about biodiversity, and not always in a good way, because what people mostly point out is that it tends to be collapsing right now. Is that true? Does it actually show? Can it be measured concretely? Yes.
So it can be measured, but we have to admit that the word is a bit tricky because there are two aspects to biodiversity. There's the word diversity, meaning there are a certain number of different species, etc. But we don't talk enough about abundance. In other words, in a given environment, if you have 3 species and only 2 individuals per species, you can see that it won't work the same way as if you have 3 species and 10,000 individuals per species. So what we're describing today is more about losses in abundance. When we say that we've lost 30% of common birds, for example, in agricultural environments, it's more about losses in abundance. On the other hand, what has been well documented since roughly the 16th century are species that humans have seen, described, drawn, so we know they saw them, and that have disappeared. And we can actually have this record of 400 or 500 or 600 species that humans have seen and that have disappeared. And we can compare this disappearance to the number of species we should have seen disappear if it were the normal rate of evolution. Because actually, statistically speaking, a species, quote unquote, lives between 1 and 10 million years as its lifespan. That means that since life began 3 billion years ago, 99% of the species that have lived on our planet have disappeared. So we can do a little calculation. We arrive at the conclusion that instead of seeing 400 or 500 disappear, we should have seen about 10. That's why, as scientists say, it's happening 100 to 1,000 times faster than the natural rate of species renewal. So we actually have precise data on abundance in the United States, Great Britain, and Europe in general. Next, there's the loss of species. I'll take an example that's been widely discussed, which is the species of giant ostriches from New Zealand, which were about 4 times bigger than today's ostriches. And there's a testimony from a person apparently trustworthy who says, I saw when I was little the last of these giant ostriches. So the consensus, then we'll discuss what the cause is, but the consensus that we're losing biodiversity and that we're losing it at a worrying rate, I'd say there's no doubt about it, as we commonly say.
All right. And is that something serious? Does losing this biodiversity actually have a concrete impact on nature and therefore also on ourselves? Or is it something that will naturally renew itself?
So first of all, the question, is it serious? That is, when we say, you know, there are at least 10 million species and we've only described about 2 million. People often say, but do we really need all these species? Well, and I answer a bit with the game of pickup sticks, you know, it's that game where there are intertwined wooden sticks and you're asked the question, can I remove a stick without moving the others? And at the beginning of the game, you can do it. Then, as you take out the easier ones, well, at some point you think you can remove one more and boom, it collapses. All right. And so today we can't say that all species are absolutely essential, but we need to keep that Mikado image in mind. That is, at some point we might think we can remove a species and there won't be a problem, but we'll see that in fact it doesn't last. And then the other element, maybe more philosophical, is that for our species, for the human species, if you ask this question, if you ask your neighbor, Sir, I don't mind that you exist, but only if you can prove to me that you're useful for something. Well, you wouldn't dare do that to your neighbor unless you hate him. So why should we have the right to exist just like that, simply because we have the right to exist? And why would we deny other species that live on our planet with us the right to exist as such? So I like to tell people, you have to be like Jiminy Cricket. If you decide to kill a living being, always ask yourself, by what right? By what right? That little voice in your head. Sometimes it can happen, for example, when there's been an epidemic, like with tiger mosquitoes in places where they transmit diseases, eradicating those mosquitoes. Why not? But you always have to ask yourself the question, if I decide that I don't want this individual or this species anymore, well, I have to ask myself, but who am I? Who are we as a species, having arrived so recently? Because as we've said, it all started 3 billion years ago. We, Homo sapiens, have only been here for 300,000 years. So we arrived at 1:45 on the planet after 365 days. And so we show up like that, and then we say, no, the others get out. But by what right?
You said that you also worked a lot on the oceans, well, on life in the ocean environment. What specific area were you able to study?
Let's say that at the beginning of my career, it was the start of aquaculture. That is to say, people were saying we could already see that fishing resources were reaching their limits, and we were even seeing overexploitation of certain stocks. And the idea was, well, we need to farm these aquatic species. Just like 10 or 20,000 years ago, we domesticated cows, pigs, chickens, and so on to do farming. And so the idea was to start farming with trout, salmon, carp, and so on. So there are countries where it was a very old tradition. For example, China had a very old tradition of farming different species of carp. So there are countries that were already doing it. In France, we had the case of oyster production, which goes back to about the middle of the 19th century. So there was a whole profession that knew how to farm oysters. But on the other hand, there were lots of species that we didn't know how to farm because they were in the wild, and so we fished them. And so I took part in this adventure to see if there were species that we could actually domesticate and farm, which raises the question, what do they eat? How do we feed them? Do they have diseases? How do we treat them? How do we get them to reproduce? So studying the biology of these species and seeing what we could do. And so they could be European species. And then I also worked in French Guiana, where basically in French Guiana, you see it's about the size of Brittany, roughly in terms of area. And there are 10 times more fish species than in all of France, because it's an equatorial or tropical environment, so there's extraordinary diversity. So we wondered if there might be species there that we could farm. And so we were doing experiments to see what environment, what they needed, and so on. So that was the great adventure of domesticating species, shrimp as well, species of that kind.
All right, so being able to have these farm species allows us to avoid overexploiting natural environments, if I understand correctly.
Yes, but only if we can feed them with something other than by fishing for other fish. That was the debate. At first we wondered, for example, what does a salmon eat in the sea? Well, it eats fish or other resources. And so if we had to keep doing that, fishing for fish to feed other fish, it wasn't very worthwhile. So we really had to figure out how, so not to completely eliminate resources like fish or fish meal, but also to see if with feeds that contain plants, we could make these animals not herbivores, but a bit less carnivorous, which isn't always easy.
Regarding these aquatic environments, I've heard that it's actually the oceans that are the real lungs of the Earth. That is to say, it's the organisms living in the oceans that have a major impact on oxygen production. Is that true? Is it something that's real?
So there's already a paradox, because we also talk about the Amazon as the lung, but the lung doesn't release oxygen, it releases carbon dioxide. So I don't know why we use that word lung, because actually, no, a lung is the opposite of what we mean. Well, in the case of the forest and the Amazon rainforest, unfortunately, that's not true. That is to say, an ancient forest, one that has been there for a long time in balance. At certain times, it will indeed absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, but at other times, on the contrary, it will consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Because especially in the soil, there is a lot of organic matter decomposing and consuming oxygen. So, roughly speaking, an old forest like the intertropical forests, well, it's neutral from a respiration point of view. In the case of the ocean, for the balance to be positive, that is, for it to produce more oxygen than its carbon dioxide pump, you need to find a mechanism that prevents the carbon dioxide from coming back out. And that, well, it's little living beings that live in the surface layer where there's light, who capture sunlight, and who often make a little shell. It's tiny, you can only see it under a microscope, a very small shell. Limestone, and when these living beings die, this little bit of limestone sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So it sinks and it moves about 1 millimeter per century. 1 millimeter per century, that's how the cliffs of Etretat were formed. The cliffs of Etretat, if you look at them under a microscope, it's these tiny organisms that year after year, century after century, have accumulated at the bottom of the oceans. Okay? The problem is that when it gets warmer, the ocean becomes a little more acidic, and these little creatures can no longer make a shell that will sink. In other words, they have trouble making their shell. And so that means the shell might stay on the surface and dissolve again. And so the ocean's ability to produce oxygen for us could very well slow down, because its ability to absorb carbon dioxide is also slowing down. You might ask, if all living beings are going on an oxygen strike, and if the trees in the cities no longer want to produce oxygen and so on, what will happen? Well, the good news is that we won't die of asphyxiation, because it would take hundreds of years to use up the oxygen that's in the atmosphere. The bad news is that we'll die of hunger, and much more quickly. Because in fact, if they go on strike from producing oxygen, they won't produce any more food either.
Right.
Voilà. So the good news is that we won't die of asphyxiation. The bad news is that we'll die of hunger.
Yeah, that's not necessarily the best option.
So here too we need to give some sense of the time scales. But today, indeed, getting people to understand these long time scales, and then saying, for example, in about 3,000 years there will be 120 meters of water over Paris. That makes you think. So you could say, in 3,000 years, the number of stupid things we could do. Well, we've got time. But you still have to put people back in their place, and that's the point. The point of biodiversity is to make them realize that they're just small, fleeting creatures who, on the scale of life, last only a few seconds. And since we're supposed to be intelligent beings, we should put ourselves in this perspective. What are we doing to pass things on to those who will come after us? To leave living conditions that are at least as good as the ones we've known, and if possible, even better in many places around the world. That's also what we're trying to say when we talk about biodiversity.
So let's get back to those organisms in the ocean that capture CO2 to make a shell. Du coup, obviously it creates a self-amplifying effect, because if CO2 causes the greenhouse effect and therefore contributes to warming, and the heat of the oceans contributes to the acidification of the oceans. And so it prevents these organisms from capturing more CO2, which means the effect produced by CO2 will self-amplify over time.
Yes, you understood perfectly. The problem is that today we estimate that all this carbon dioxide is absorbed by some of the forests, the ocean and others. Saves us somewhere between 1/3 and half of the greenhouse effect, meaning it absorbs about 1/3 of all the carbon dioxide we emit. So they buy us some time. They slow things down precisely because they absorb some of the carbon dioxide we emit. But if they start to go on strike, like I was telling you, then all the CO2 we emit won't be absorbed anymore. Even if we say we're going to pump it and put it into oil fields, but today it's still not at the scale of the problem, and that's the real issue. For example, you know that there's a lot of talk about 4 degrees of warming by the year 2100. It's not said enough that if we're at 4 degrees in 2100, it means we haven't solved the problem. In other words, it means we'll be on a trajectory that keeps rising. And based on that, we can calculate that if we were stupid, which can happen, and we decided to say renewable energies and all that, we don't care. We're going to keep burning all our gas, all our oil, and all our coal. We're going to use up all the fossil fuel reserves, and we know that, for example, with coal, we can keep burning it for another 200 or 300 years. So there's too much coal. Well, there's more than enough. It's not 4 degrees, it's 11 degrees. And at 11 degrees, it's impossible to know what could happen. It's absolute horror. So the challenge we have is, how are we going to be smart enough to do without something that will remain abundant and cheap? So constantly, and look at what's happening in the United States, constantly there's the temptation to say electric cars, renewable energy, all that. It's nonsense, we don't care. We just go for the cheapest energy. Well, and you may have heard that we've discovered, or at least we think we've discovered, a huge gas deposit under the Mediterranean off the French coast. And so if we stick with this mindset saying, keep using the cheapest energy and it will stay cheap, you have to realize that if you look at the last 20 years' electricity, the price of electricity has increased faster than the price of oil. And so that's still a huge challenge, all right? So you might say that we managed to do without resources that remained abundant and cheap, like when we stopped using flint tools, since there's still a lot of flint left. And yet, at some point in human history, well, it wasn't because there were negative effects from flint, it was because we had invented metallurgy and decided it was more practical to move on to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Sometimes we go without things that are still plentiful. If we have something better,
So, to go along with this theme, do we have any concrete solutions today to avoid having too negative an impact on our environment? Or for now, is it still pretty hypothetical?
So we really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, meaning we have to say, we know what the factors responsible for biodiversity loss are, but from one species to another, those factors will be different. There are species where we just need to leave them alone, meaning if we stop exploiting them, they can recover more or less quickly, depending on the biology of the species. Let me give you 2 examples. The beaver, which was an extremely abundant species throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, by the end of the 19th century there were only a handful left in the Rhone Delta. There were none left in all of France. But when you look at France, there are lots of places called Bièvres and so on. Bièvre means beaver. That's the etymology, beaver in English. So those were places where there used to be beavers everywhere. In 1909, they simply banned beaver hunting. It was an animal that had a lot of flaws, and it could be eaten during Lent because it was considered a fish by the church. It had fur that was very warm, like Davy Crockett's hat. It wasn't a beaver, but it was that kind of thing. And above all, it had secretions that were considered aphrodisiacs. So people hunted the beaver, really. It was a source of food, that's it. In 1909, they said it was forbidden to hunt the beaver. Our good old beaver made its way back up the entire Rhone Valley through the Saône. There were relocations, but now beavers are nearly everywhere in France and things are improving. The other example is whales. Whales came very close to extinction, and apart from the Japanese now, and to some extent the Icelanders, we've managed to limit things a lot, and now they're coming back too. So there are species where, well, we know that if we just stop overexploiting them, things will be fine. Then there are species that are subjected to pollution. In these cases, for example, with birds of prey, we know that they are very sensitive to pesticides. So why is that? Because a bird of prey eats other animals, which themselves eat plants. So you see, if we treat plants with chemicals, it will accumulate. So those we call who are at the end of the chain, what we call the food chain, well, they will accumulate. and so they will have particularly high concentrations. And so we realized that in addition to our problem with calcium, it was blocking the fixation of carbon in the eggshell. So it made soft eggs. And today we hear a lot about endocrine disruptors, forever chemicals and so on, agrochemicals and so on. Well, actually we realized it because some species living in the wild told us, oh, there's a little problem, maybe you should look at what's happening to us. Just like we saw fish that became both male and female because those substances also disrupted their reproduction. And so indeed we can clearly see that there are species very likely that are being wiped out, especially because of pesticides in particular. It can be some rather silly kinds of pollution. I'll give you an example from Brittany. You know that Brittany is a very beautiful region, and that there were still salmon swimming up the rivers, and the salmon swim upstream, not just for the pleasure of swimming up the rivers, but it's because it needs fairly cool water, and especially a place where there are large gravel stones on the riverbed, because that way it lays its eggs. The eggs settle between the stones, and since they're large stones, water flows through them and brings oxygen to the eggs. They can develop. If you develop corn farming on the watershed, and it rains during the winter, and that causes soil to tumble into the river, well, it's going to clog up the gravel bed. So the water stays nice and clear, it's not polluted, but the eggs that end up covered in clay die. So you don't see salmon carcasses on the surface, you don't see massive die-offs. But small signs like this, which we aren't sensitive to, can be enough to disturb a species and even cause it to disappear. Right. Let me give you another example, which is a bit silly. You know that many insects, to attract males or females, emit substances that are detected. Well, the ears of insects, their antennae. And so these molecules are detected by the females, and the females will go toward the male. But in cities, at ground level, there's a lot of ozone. That's why babies shouldn't be in cities or pushed in strollers too close to the ground. Now, ozone is an oxidant. It's something that will destroy organic molecules, and it will especially destroy these olfactory signals. It's like someone cut your internet fiber optic cable. So the female, she searches. Bon, you really have to understand that all these living beings, to live, they're like us. They need to communicate with each other, to exchange sound signals. For example, you know that city birds sing a bit higher than country birds, to make themselves heard a bit better since there's a lot of low-frequency noise. So they adapt a little, but they need to emit sound signals, possibly magnetic signals, chemical signals, to communicate with each other and to recognize one another. And so we really need to pay attention to the fact that we are big creatures, and we can very easily disrupt this whole internet of living things, if only because we can't sense these substances and there are lots of sounds we can't hear. For example, a cow can hear up to a frequency that's about twice as high as what we can hear. For me, at my age, it's even 4 times higher. You know, as we get older, we hear high-pitched sounds less and less. So the cow will hear things that we can't hear, which can alert her and possibly disturb her. Similarly, you know that whales, on the other hand, hear very low frequencies. So all this signaling, this whole network of messages that living beings exchange with each other, they need it, and we really have to remember not to act like a bull in a china shop.
It's true, it's complicated, because when I hear that, I feel like, in fact, no matter what we try to do, we inevitably have an impact on living things, whether it's on things that seem obvious and that we know we can affect, but sometimes on things that are much more subtle, things we don't necessarily realize. How can we control the impact we have?
You see, there are species that really need us to leave them alone completely. I'll take the example of the capercaillie. The capercaillie is that big bird that hibernates under the snow in the mountains where there's snow, and it stays at a slightly lower temperature under the snow all winter. If someone goes off-trail hiking and disturbs the capercaillie while it's hibernating, the capercaillie will take flight. So first it has to warm up, and it's said that if it's disturbed just twice during the winter, it won't survive. It's the same for bats. You know that bats hibernate in caves? If you accidentally enter a cave where there are bats, it's going to be a huge panic, and by the time they settle down again, they'll have used up some of their reserves. These little creatures don't have many reserves. These are really species for which we need to find completely protected areas where we tell humans, sorry, but here you have to tread very lightly and only a few people at a time, and that's what we call a strict reserve. There are other species that aren't as sensitive. As I said before, we need to use human judgment and understand their requirements. I prefer to say habits, since species don't really have requirements, just minimum needs. We really need to see which ones just need us to stop exploiting them and which ones might need more significant protection.
All the more so because we are part of this ecosystem. Sure, we have a huge impact on the life around us, but the life around us also has an impact on our own lives. So earlier we said that we shouldn't necessarily classify species based on how useful they are. Especially since very often when we judge the usefulness of a species, we judge it in relation to ourselves. But there are a huge number of species that provide us with a very specific, valuable service, and that actually allow us to live. So, do we have any examples of these species?
I gave you the example indeed of those species that alert us. What we call biodiversity is humanity's life insurance. In other words, these are species we can consider as sentinels in a certain way, and there's the case of species that function, for example, by producing oxygen, but there are others that, for example, will remove excess pesticides or excess nitrates from the water. That means we don't need to build water treatment plants. There's an example that's always mentioned, which is the city of New York, which had to choose to supply the city with drinking water between building water treatment plants or redeveloping the entire watershed to have very low polluting agriculture. And so they calculated that building water treatment plants would cost 10 billion, while redeveloping the watershed would only cost 2 billion, so they saved 8 billion by using biodiversity's ability to naturally purify water. And then there are cases where, by imitating living things and the know-how of nature, we find solutions to problems. I'll give you an example that you may have experienced. During COVID, to find out if you had the disease or not, they did something a bit unpleasant by swabbing your nose, and they told you, we're going to do a PCR test. Maybe you remember that. So what's the story here? Well, more than 50 years ago, there was an American biologist, back when American scientists could do whatever they wanted, who thought to himself, hey, in the geysers of Yellowstone, in Yellowstone National Park, where the water is 70 degrees Celsius, is there life in that water? And he looked, and he saw that there were things that looked like bacteria. And then he said, well, yes, but are they really alive? And he showed that they reproduced at 70 degrees Celsius. Reproducing at 70 degrees Celsius means that they were able to multiply their genetic material, their DNA, at 70 degrees Celsius. So he looked at how it worked, and then he said, well, if I take a tiny piece of DNA from the nose, since when they scraped the back of your nose, there might have been 5 or 6 viruses. And so if we can extract all that, this little piece of DNA, and then multiply it very quickly using what these bacteria do, we have enough DNA to actually say whether it's the DNA of COVID or if it's not the DNA of COVID. So this absolutely fundamental result from more than 50 years ago, fortunately we had it to actually be able to very quickly diagnose people who had COVID or not. So there is, if you will, a whole range of know-how from living beings that we're glad to discover, often long after. Let me give you an example that I like. You know carrots? Well, the carrot, we thought we knew everything about the carrot. A chemist quite some time ago extracted a strange molecule from the carrot and managed to crystallize it. I'll skip the name, it's a real tongue twister. But he crystallized it and noticed that it changed color with temperature. He said, well, that's interesting. And that's how the first liquid crystal displays were made. That was the discovery of liquid crystals, meaning those crystals, you see, whose display changes when you put a small resistor behind them. And so it was a carrot that could also make liquid crystals. And we discovered that a long time later. I could give you plenty of other examples where So, to sum up, it means that living things are like a huge library of books, of things that living beings know how to do, and we've only read a tiny part of it. And so that means when we ask the question, should we keep all these species? That's what you were saying earlier. The answer is, if we haven't read the books, maybe it's better to keep them.
By the way, to get back to some species that are sometimes a bit unusual, are there any examples in living things that have struck you, that maybe surprised you, that you didn't expect?
Let's just say that sometimes we think, how could such a species have made it all the way to us? I'll give you an example. It's what we commonly call a daddy longlegs, that big-legged mosquito, the clumsy one. It's unbelievable getting caught in the slightest speck of dust or spiderweb and so on. The scientific name is a cranefly, so it's not harmful at all. It doesn't bite, it's fine. But I wonder, how did this thing even get to us? In other words, for 3 billion years, living beings have been constantly reinventing themselves. Since we've never seen an extinct species reappear, it's other species that show up there. But none of them has found the definitive solution. In other words, they've all found ways to exist for more or less time. And then constantly they create new things, and that's what's amazing, and maybe that's something that should inspire us a little. It's that, rather than saying we're going to find the ultimate solution to all our problems, well, saying that all living beings, and therefore all humans, might have solutions to offer for tomorrow's problems. Maybe that's what it teaches us, a certain humility. We shouldn't imagine that we alone have the brilliant solution. We have to say that collectively we're trying to adapt, to invent, and so on. Because one of the recent things in biology is that now that we can look at what we call the genome, meaning the genetic material, we can calculate, for example, for humans, how many different possible human beings there are. We can say, by focusing on the genome, we find that there are billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of different possible human beings, which means that we will never have two identical living beings. That is to say, with each generation, living beings do not reproduce, they renew themselves, because to reproduce would mean that they would be even two twins. We know genetically that they are not completely identical. And so living beings are constantly renewing themselves, testing small variations, seeing if it works, if it doesn't work, and so on. And then the environment changes. So what was valid at one point is no longer valid at another time. And it's a kind of extraordinary mechanism that's been going on for 3 billion years, constantly reinventing itself with entities that don't last long. We have to remember that most living beings live less than a year, weigh less than a gram, and move less than a meter during their lifetime. So we are very special. So these little things that last just a moment, that's what makes up life, which has been constantly renewed for 3 billion years.
There we saw all the life teeming around us, but from what I understand, life is also teeming inside us. We also talk about the microbiota. We also talk about different species that are even in our mucous membranes on our skin. Do all these species interact with us? Are they part of us? Or should we really see them as entities that are separate from us?
It depends on how you want to think about yourself, meaning you have the information, you just gave it. That is to say, on the surface of our skin, in our eyelashes, in our mouth, inside our digestive tract. Well, there are lots of other living beings, and we know that they are very diverse, even genetically. If they are there, it's because they find it beneficial. In other words, we help feed them, but in return, they protect us. For example, you don't ask the question, is my brain a part of me? Yet you know very well that your brain from time to time does things without asking for your opinion. Well, but you don't hold it against it. You say, it's me, it's still me, even if sometimes it leads you astray, but well. For example, an extraordinary thing is the number of things your brain decides to remember that are absolutely useless. Search your memory. I'm sure you have in mind, for example, the license plate number of your first scooter, or, I don't know, information that the brain decided to keep that is useless. Sometimes you want to remember things, but your brain refuses. It does its own thing in its corner, but it's still part of you. And indeed, that's the question. Indeed, this flora that lives with us in harmony, that protects us, do you decide to take care of it by saying it's a part of me? Or even when you say you take care of your muscles, your heart, etc., do you say it's an organ that belongs to me? Or do you say, well, I keep these because I can't do otherwise? Ultimately, unless I constantly take antibiotics, which wouldn't work, you'd quickly notice the problem. Okay.
Then again, I think my point of view may be arbitrary, but I also see it in relation to DNA. That is to say, each of the cells in my body, including those in my brain, shares, or at least seems to share, the same DNA as me, as the other cells in my body. Whereas the microbiota are microorganisms that are not directly connected to that.
It's a mystery of biology. Why do the cells of an organism like you and me absolutely insist on carefully preserving their genetic material? That makes sense regarding reproductive cells. Sperm and eggs, it's normal for them to transmit genetic material. But your skin cells, why would they care about keeping their DNA? They're never going to, unless you decide to clone yourself, but that's a long way off. They don't have a future. So some have made the leap. For example, red blood cells got rid of their DNA. There's no more DNA in red blood cells. There are others that, on the contrary, have only kept a part of it. For example, your cells that react to diseases, what we call the immune response. Well, you only keep certain things. You even amplify them. Your liver cells also change. So it's not exactly the same genetic material from one cell to another, but it's still a mystery. And so for me, that's not my answer, but it's my view of things. Is that beings we call complex organisms, meaning made up of a group of cells that are differentiated, that form organs, tissues, and so on. It's relatively rare. Most living beings have remained at the single cell stage, both in terms of diversity and the amount of living matter. We tend to notice mostly things that are visible, but the majority of living things remain at the single cell stage. And I think to myself, these organized beings are still recent on the scale of evolution. So the cell said, oh, let's be careful, let's keep it in reserve for the day when these organized species might do something foolish. Let's keep our ability to live as single cells. You never know.
All right. So I would like to...
And that's why, preserving that inside you, the single cell state, you never know.
I would also like to come back to something we already touched on earlier, but I still want to revisit it because it seems important to me, and it's also one of the ideas that the book really wants to convey. For a very long time, species were classified into two categories, pests on one side and beneficial ones on the other. So how should we consider the species that surround us? What perspective should we have on this? Also, what should we think about this very binary view of different species?
We have to realize that it's often humans who make species harmful. In other words, a species, I'll give you an example, it doesn't just decide to be harmful, like saying, hey, I'm going to decide to be harmful. The best example I know is Legionnaire's disease, legionellosis. You might remember a few decades ago there was a big gathering of American Army veterans in a large hotel in the United States, and they all got sick. So they investigated and found out that it was a bacterium called Legionella. And the microbiologists, those who study bacteria, said, we don't understand. Legionella can easily be found in a pond or even in a river. There are plenty of them and there's no problem. What is this thing? And then we understood if you swim in water where there are Legionella, they're just on the surface of your skin and so on. And so they don't penetrate. But here, what did we do? We had installed air conditioning. Meaning we sprayed water vapor. And so at that moment, the Legionella bacteria reached the pulmonary alveoli and not the digestive tract. And once it reached the pulmonary alveolus, the Legionella did what it usually does. It multiplied, it did its little Legionella job. Unfortunately, that caused an infection. You see, this is a good example that actually shows that sometimes it's a modification. It was often said during the COVID period that it was because we had destroyed so much of the forest that animals potentially carrying this disease came closer to humans. We have plenty of examples like this. So in fact, a species sometimes does cause problems because we've changed the habitat. And that's also the problem we can have in agriculture. It's obvious that if you plant during a time when there's not much to eat in the fields, if you plant seeds and there are animals that are hungry, they're going to eat your seeds. And so the question is, indeed, there are things that we don't like. Let's see how we can limit it, but without having the answer be, we just have to kill the species that's bothering us. Isn't there another solution that involves slightly changing our practices to prevent these behaviors? That's what we need to get people to understand by saying, analyze it. What is causing the problem before saying it's necessarily this species? You might be causing the problem as much as that species. And then on top of that, you have to look at each situation. There can be cases where in a given place there is a real problem. For example, when there was the debate about foxes and rabies, there were places where indeed there were significant risks, and not say it's the species. It is classified nationwide as a harmful species and may be destroyed. So it's necessary. And then, as I was saying at the beginning, this criterion of usefulness or lack thereof, it's about saying, listen, all these species represent life on our planet today, and can't we still make a little space for them? So when I say a little space, there's a fairly recent scientific study that said, let's look at what the planet was like 100,000 years ago. So at first there were a few humans, but very few. So all mammals were wild, since in fact the first domestications happened 20,000 or 30,000 years ago with the dog and so on. So all mammals were wild. If we look today, if we take all the mammals on the planet, well, only 4 to 5% of mammals are still wild. The rest are either humans, about a third, or domesticated animals like pigs, cows, sheep, and so on, 2/3. So that means that humans and their group of domesticated animals that we've raised for food now make up 95% of the mammals on the planet. So still the question is, of course, we have the right to exist. But on this planet where, as we said, we arrived a bit late, shouldn't we still make room so that other living beings can continue to exist? That's something we really need to think about.
For those who listen to our interview and would like to learn a little more, do you have any books to recommend to them, including ones you have written?
Well, there's a book called Seeing Life Differently that I wrote about biodiversity. A somewhat old book, but one that I really like, is the book by Robert Barbeau called An Elephant in a China Shop. And then more recently, there are the wonderful books by Marc-André Sellos. So there are several that he has written about microorganisms, about soil biology, and so on. So those are also very easy to read. And then recently I made not a book, but a very small booklet that's 15 small pages in a very small format, because I was a bit tired of seeing people, especially when meeting politicians, saying that biodiversity is complicated. So I said to myself, well, here's the little book, put it in your pocket, and every time you're on the subway or have 5 minutes, you read a page and you'll know more than enough if you want to take action for biodiversity. We're trying indeed. And then at the beginning of January, I launched some short audio stories called The Little Stories of Biodiversity, which you can listen to on all platforms. So every Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, we put a new one online. So these are short audio clips of 7 to 8 minutes where we tell a little story about biodiversity.
Okay, well, we'll put that in the description. In any case, thank you very much for this interview, which was extremely interesting.
Thank you.